it is a privilege to be here with you today to introduce our panelists on such important event for both the United States of America and Mexico. And I should mention also very important for legal certainty from a human rights perspective, from a legal interpretation perspective, from an immigration perspective. So this is a matter that is very relevant to both of our countries. Daca and the decision that was issued by the Supreme Court of Justice, where the Supreme Court of Justice decided to rule that the annulment or cancellation or revocal of Daca should not prevail. We will have to understand clearly the reasons of why it does not prevail, and if the U.S. executive can still revoke Daca on a future decision. We'll have to hear and understand this from our panelists. We have the privilege actually today. The panel, our invitees, couldn't be more representative on this matter. We have the privilege of having with us Secretary Janet Napolitano, who is a professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. She served as the 20th president of the University of California, which is the nation's largest public research university with 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, 3 affiliated national laboratories, and a statewide agriculture and natural resources program. Prior to joining the University of California, President Napolitano served as Secretary of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013. I should mention that this was the time, 2012, when Daca was issued. She's a former 2-term governor of Arizona, a former Attorney General of Arizona, and a former U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. In 2019, Janet published How Safe Are We? Homeland Security since 9/11. President Napolitano earned her BS degree summa cum laude in political science from Santa Clara University and her JD from the University of Virginia. She is based in Berkeley, California. We also have the privilege of having with us Alan Bersin, who is a friend and has contributed a lot to the Aspen Institute, both in the United States and Mexico, I assume also elsewhere, but with great commitment to Aspen Institute Mexico. Alan Bersin serves the global law firm of Covington and Burling as a senior advisor to the firm, as inaugural senior fellow in the Homeland Security Project at the Belfer Center, Harvard Kennedy School of Government, as a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., as the inaugural North America Fellow at the Canada Institute and the Mexico Institute Wilson Center, and as a member of the advisory committee to the Quebec Government Office in Washington. He is chairman of Border Works Group, a consulting firm specializing in matters of border security and management, and executive chairman of Atlanta Trade, an enterprise devoted to providing machine learning and artificial intelligence-based insights on border management and global trade. Alan Bersin was appointed by President Obama as U.S. Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection and served as Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs and Chief Diplomatic Officer for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS. What is most relevant here is that Alan worked together with Secretary Napolitano on Daca in the year 2012. And as well, Alan has been key in the litigation handled by the firm where he currently works out, Covington and Burling, hired by the University of California. He has been key to in the discussions to finally get the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court of Justice decision. So it's a privilege to have you here, Alan. And then we have Mariana Sanchez Ramirez and Mitchell Santos Toledo. Mariana Sanchez Ramirez is an experienced communicator with a demonstrated history of working in the think tank industry. At the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, she develops and executes the Institute's communication strategy and oversees the Institute's publications. Mariana has created and curated multimedia content, and Mariana helps educate policymakers and public on the importance of the U.S.-Canada relationship and the North America region. She's a producer and editor of America's 360, a podcast about the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. She was previously at the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, where she assisted in research, created visual content, provided operational support. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Young Professionals Briefing Series in Washington. In 2018, Mariana was selected to attend the German Marshall's Fund, and she holds a BA in Political Science from the University of South Florida Honors College in Tampa, Florida. Michelle Santos, thank you for being here. Mitchell Santos, he's a Daca recipient from Toluca, Mexico, and he's a 2020 graduate of Harvard Law School. At Harvard, he served as a student attorney for the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic, teaching fellow for the globally taught Copyright X course, and as an article editor for the Harvard Latinx Law Review. During his time at Harvard, Mitchell also worked with the Career Services and Admissions departments to increase the outreach to and retention of law students of color and from economically diverse backgrounds at Harvard Law. Prior to HLS, Mitchell obtained his BA in Legal Studies, summa cum laude from the University of California in Berkeley in May 2016. Mitchell served as a declarant in the U.S. Supreme Court case of the Department of Homeland Security against regents of the University of California. He will start as an intellectual property litigation associate at global law firm Sidley Austin LLP in fall 2020. It's a privilege to have you here, Mariana and Mitchell. And in order, I actually, for obvious reasons, read the short version of Janet Napolitano's bio and Alan Bersin's bio. As well, we have to select some parts of the bio of Mariana and Mitchell. Thank you all for being here. And at this point, I would like to ask our executive director of Aspen Institute Mexico, Ambassador Enrique Berruga, to lead the moderation of this panel.
Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you, Jan. Thank you, Alan, Mitchell, and Mariana for being with us. It's a great privilege indeed to have you here with us. I would like to start by saying that one of our participants today is the rector of the National University of Mexico, Dr. Enrique Graue, Tocayo. Very welcome to our webinar today. I think it's a very important day in terms of what Mexico and the US at the human level connect and how we would deal with these issues in the future. Thank you for being here, as well as the rest of the participants. Janet, I'd like to start to kick off with you, if I may. You are the architect of Daca. Can you walk us through a little bit on how you came up with this idea, what prompted it, what the political needs, what human needs were at the table when you started dealing with this issue?
Yes, thank you. I'm really pleased to be a member of this panel. The Department of Homeland Security has the responsibility for the enforcement of the nation's immigration laws. And of course, the problem with that is that the nation's immigration law in the United States is way out of date and doesn't match with the needs of the United States for an immigrant flow, nor does it match with our values, particularly where individuals who are undocumented but have been residing in the country for a while are concerned. During Obama's first term, there were efforts made to achieve what was known as comprehensive immigration reform, to have the Congress take the nation's immigration laws writ large and fix them. Congress struggled with this and was unable to take on such a complicated and politically difficult topic. But in the meantime, there was continued advocacy from a group that were then known as Dreamers. They don't use that name anymore, but that's how they were known at the time. Young people who were brought here typically before the age of 6, who had grown up in this country, really knew only the United States as home, were attending our nation's universities and colleges, were in our military. Some had started families of their own in the United States. The only problem was they were undocumented. And so they lived in constant fear that they would be put into deportation proceedings, and they couldn't get authorization to work legally, so they were thrown into the underground economy. There was an effort at the end of 2010 to pass a bill solely related to the Dreamers, and it failed by just a handful of votes in the United States Senate. But as time went on, it just seemed to me that as the leader of the department that had the responsibility for immigration enforcement, that we needed to find a fix for these young people. And so as secretary, I called together a group of leaders in the department, including Alan, I believe, was there. And I said, look, we need to find, rooted in the law, a way to deal with the Dreamer population. And they came back initially with a proposal that only would have affected Dreamers who were already in deportation proceedings, those who had already been picked up. And it wasn't very many, it was fewer than a dozen. But that still left the majority of the population living in fear and without the ability to work. And so I said, no, go back and figure out something better so that we can cover the entire group. They went back to the law books, and in the United States, as in many countries, there's a concept rooted in the law called prosecutorial discretion. And what that means is that law enforcement organizations can decide for themselves what cases they are going to bring and what cases they're going to put a priority on and those that they are not. So that, for example, in the United States Department of Justice, they will prosecute bank fraud cases, but they won't prosecute individual bad check cases. Those are just deemed unworthy of thrusting the entire weight of the federal government against. And using that concept, we said, using the concept of prosecutorial discretion, we are going to figure out a way to defer action. And by that we meant to defer deportation for those who had arrived as children in the United States, for childhood arrivals. So deferred action for childhood arrivals, or DACA. We worked it up as a proposal for the White House to consider. We went to the Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel, and got a memorandum that confirmed that what we were proposing indeed was lawful. We went back and forth with the White House on it until finally the president agreed. DACA itself was announced by the president from the Rose Garden in June of 2012. There's actually not a presidential order on DACA. The way the actual documents that form it are consist of a memorandum that I issued to the Department of Homeland Security. When the president announced the program in June, he said that it would be operational by August. So he gave us 60 days to go from a program that existed only on paper to a fully operationalized program. So we had a lot to do. We had to develop the forms. We had to develop the criteria. We had to train those who would be receiving the applications on what they could consider, what documents would need to be produced by an applicant. We had to set the fee because the program had to pay for itself. We had no additional federal funds to pay for the program. And frankly, we didn't know when it started whether we would have initially 5 applicants or 50 or 500. In the end, there were some 800,000 young people who qualified and were given DACA. And almost 2,000 of those were students at the University of California, where I became the president after having served as secretary. when DACA was announced, it was interesting. We expected immediate lawsuits challenging the program. We expected a lot of resistance, primarily from Republicans, to it. But it was very popular from the get-go and remains very popular to people in both Democratic and Republican parties. Nonetheless, when President Trump took office, he said different things about the DACA recipients. He called them the dreamers. He said, my heart is, I love the dreamers. My heart goes out for the dreamers. The dreamers don't need to worry, etc. Then his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced that he had concluded that DACA was illegal and was directing the Department of Homeland Security to rescind the program. The Department of Homeland Security, in a very abbreviated memo, rescinded the program. Then we went, and as the president of the University of California, we went to Covington and Burling, or Covington and Burling came to us. Alan, I'm not quite sure of that sequence. Anyway, we ended up being represented excellently by the law firm Covington and Burling to challenge the rescission of DACA. And making me, I think, the only cabinet secretary who has sued her successor. But in any event, that was kind of the genesis of DACA. That was the legal theory on which it was based. That gives you a little sense of the politics. And I'll turn it over now. Enrique, I think I should turn it over to Alan to discuss the legal case.
Actually, I was going to ask him, there's another case, Alan, that the Trump administration lost to the NAACP, right? To the National Association of Colored People for Advancement of Colored People. Right now, you will correct me, Janet, but I believe that there are more than 950,000 applicants on this right now in the program. That's the latest figure I could see. But on the legal issues, Alan, where do we stand today? Are we still in a limbo after Jeff Sessions' decision, or this new trial, this new judgment by the NAACP and the Trump administration has changed the dynamics of this?
Thank you, Ambassador, and Luis Arado, Chairman Luis Arado Valle, for the opportunity to work with Aspen Mexico to present this story. Just to listen to Secretary Napolitano retell the story from the person who created this program still gives me the chills, because in fact it was an extraordinary result for people like Mitchell and Mariana, and 800,000 or more young people who are part of this country and have made this contribution. What the Secretary indicated in terms of the political backdrop actually is critical to the understanding the legal situation even up to today, because as Mitchell and Mariana will tell you, and all the DACA recipients understand, the decision of the Supreme Court in June of this year, decision issued on June 18th, actually is a deferral in effect, but it accomplished a major purpose, which is to hold off the ultimate outcome here for these young people and for this country until after the November election. And this is how this developed, because there was never a dispute by either side in the course of the litigation about whether or not DHS had the authority to rescind Secretary Napolitano's 2012 memorandum declaring the program. No one ever contended that they didn't. What was the challenge was the way in which they did it. And there's a fascinating backstory, because as the Secretary said, DACA was not only a very popular program, supported by both parties, but it was intended to be used by the immigration authorities at DHS, and particularly in the White House, people like Stephen Miller, who were driving this policy, to use DACA in negotiation with Congress to actually achieve many other aims that Congress would not agree to, given the constitution of the Congress and the requirements of the lawmaking at that time. So, yes, Donald Trump waffled on DACA almost from the campaign through September of 2017, trying to use it as a leverage point with regard to the border wall that he sought to build, as well as to a whole series of changes to the immigration law that Stephen Miller and Jared Kushner were pushing in the White House. And it was only when it became clear that the Congress would not buckle, there were not enough votes in the Senate to build the wall in exchange for a congressional recognition of the Secretary's memorandum, that the litigation actually began, as the Secretary indicated, with a letter from Jeff Sessions, then the Attorney General, declaring that DACA was illegal based on a decision of the Fifth Circuit in a case arising with regard to the parents of DACA recipients. Under Jay Johnson, and in the last year or so of the Obama administration, an effort was made to use the same technique that Secretary Napolitano had devised to actually grant deferred action to the parents of DACA recipients. And that was called the DAPA program. Unlike DACA, which was not challenged in court and which consistently gained almost 70% support in public opinion polls, the DAPA decision was immediately challenged by attorneys general in red or Republican states, and the court ruled that it was an unlawful exercise of authority by the executive branch to extend the deferred action to parents. It was at that point that, having used the rescission of DACA without being able to get Congress to provide either the border wall or these other changes that were being sought in the immigration law, that DHS actually issued the rescission memorandum. And there's a very interesting backstory that's told in a book by Julie Hirschfeld Davis and Michael Shear called The Border Wars, that goes into great detail about the negotiations over DACA. The theory was that the Trump administration really did not intend and possibly could not operationally and practically deport 800,000 people. But in fact, they wanted to use it, as I said, for the leverage in the legislative process. Elaine Duke, who worked for Secretary Napolitano when she was secretary, had become the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security after John Kelly went over to the White House as the chief of staff, and before Kirstjen Nielsen was actually nominated and confirmed as the Secretary of Homeland Security. And what Elaine Duke was actually resisting, what she conceived of as a unwarranted use of DHS based on the Attorney General's declaration that the DACA memorandum was illegal. And she disagreed with the policy that was not stated, simply the declaration of illegality. After the Supreme Court ruled this in June, Elaine Duke, who I think Secretary would agree is a decent, longstanding public servant, served in the Bush administration and then in the Obama administration, before continuing into the Trump administration, refused the pressure. She had not been involved in the decision-making regarding the rescission of the Daca memorandum, and therefore she refused to actually do anything more than issue this statement that's now on the screen, a one-sentence statement regarding the rescission that did not get into any of the policy reasons underlying the decision to rescind and revoke the Daca declaration. What that did, ironically enough, was actually create the seeds for the legal challenge that took place. Because remember, no one was actually saying, and the court ultimately did not hold, that the Department of Homeland Security lacked the authority to rescind Daca. But the basis for the claim was actually that it had done so in an improper manner, that it needed to state policy reasons in order to have to be consistent with the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a requirement with regard to federal regulations and federal pronouncements. The rescission took place based solely on the basis of that memorandum of one sentence. And that was the basis when Secretary Napolitano, 3 days after the rescission, involved Covington and Burling with regard to the challenging the Trump administration. It was based, again, not on the lack of authority of DHS, but rather on the violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. That in fact, in order to get this done properly under the APA or the Administrative Procedure Act, the administration would have to look at alternatives and at the implications of rescission, most importantly being what would be the impact on 800,000 young people who had been granted this status, were working, were contributing mightily to the economy of the United States and the society of the United States, and that absent that kind of policy analysis, that the rescission was void and illegal. When then president of the University of California, which had 1,700 Daca recipients, including Mitchell, who's on the panel today, then authorized the filing of the suit, and Secretary Napolitano and the University of California became the lead plaintiffs. Ultimately, there were 3 or 4 other suits filed in New York and Maryland and elsewhere challenging Daca, but the University of California Napolitano suit was the lead case that was taken up. The claim was upheld by the district court, a Northern District judge in San Francisco, Judge Alsop, who granted a preliminary injunction that said that the Trump administration had not legally rescinded and therefore could not take away the benefits and the rights that had accrued to Daca recipients like Mariana and Mitchell and 800,000 others. What transpired then was a series of litigation measures, but resulted in the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco, the Court of Appeal, affirming the decision of the district court, Judge Alsop, again on the basis that the Administrative Procedure Act had been violated. This was an extraordinary victory, but the question always was, what happens when this case goes as it would logically and inevitably go to the Supreme Court, which granted certiorari or review and took the case for decision. The issue was what happens in a Supreme Court in which, frankly, it's seriously divided with the appointments of President Trump during his administration, tipping the balance and removing the center of the court, which had been first Sandra Day O'Connor and then Justice Kennedy. And the question was whether or not, as the Supreme Court had upheld the decision declaring DAPA illegal, whether or not the UC case could succeed. And then we learned extraordinarily in June of this year that the court affirmed the basic decision of the Ninth Circuit, the basic claim of Secretary Napolitano and the university that the Administrative Procedure Act had been violated and that the case would go back to DHS, basically holding, as a result of the very critical role played by Chief Justice Roberts, voting with the liberal wing of the Supreme Court, saying that DHS could have rescinded DACA if it had done so properly, and in effect remanded the matter to DHS. And then we get, Ambassador Baruga, to your question, what is the status today?
Right.
Well, it actually is up in the air, as I know Mitchell and Mariana and the other DACA recipients understand. By sending it back to DHS, Justice Roberts and the majority of the court basically withheld the final decision, but it's now back to the Trump administration, which almost immediately started, notwithstanding the president's contrary tweets after the decision, both saying he's looking for a deal with Congress, again trying to negotiate, but then almost immediately directing DHS to start the process of rescinding DACA in a way that would meet the requirements of the Supreme Court. Among the extraordinary things that have been happening at DHS after the Obama administration, the departure of Secretary Napolitano and Jay Johnson, was a statement by DHS, which really is quite extraordinary in its own terms, in which the department basically said under its new leader, Chad Wolf, who was in an acting capacity, basically said that the Supreme Court decision was without basis in law, which of course is an oxymoron, since the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what the law is in the United States. And in July of this year, a month after the decision, Secretary Wolf issued a memorandum that basically tried to limit the impact of the Supreme Court's decision. So it basically said that no new DACA recipient applications would be accepted, and that those who had DACA status could apply if they did so within 150 days of the expiration of their original 2-year benefit. It left open the idea that people could lose their DACA status, and it basically said any extension would be only for 1 year rather than for the 2 years that were contained in Secretary Napolitano's memorandum. That decision by Secretary Wolf has been challenged, as the ambassador indicated, and is still in litigation. But what we do know is that the decision now hinges on the US election in November. I think that it's pretty clear that if President Trump is reelected, that the DHS has the authority, and this time will actually provide a statement of policy that would permit the rescission of DACA and place 800,000 young people in jeopardy of deportation, as the secretary indicated. But if in fact there is a change in the administration, one would expect that either Congress or the new administration would take action to continue the DACA program. So like so many other things in the United States with implications obviously for Mexico and the world, we await the outcome of the November election to find out whether this extraordinary program will actually continue to the benefit of our country, or whether there will be a resumption of the rescission process and the consequences of then trying to negotiate the conclusion will remain to be seen.
Thank you very much. Tremendous, Alan. I've been getting messages for Secretary Napolitano asking for a standing ovation already. So we will do it at the end of the program, I think. I mean, you've been praised quite a bit in my chat here, all over. So, and I actually add myself to that expression of gratitude and admiration for your work, Mrs. Napolitano. I would like to turn it to Mariana for a second to see how it feels and the experience of being a Daca recipient. You're an expert on communications, Mariana, and you've been working with a number of NGOs and foundations in Washington, D.C. From the standpoint of an expert on communications, what do you see that has been missing? I mean, what is wrong on the debate that actually has polarized so much this from one administration to the next? I mean, it seems like it's almost a schizophrenic situation in which one side of the United States looks at this as one of the most salient and humane policies ever, and some others simply don't see it that way and challenge it completely and strip it. How do you see it, Mariana?
Right. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you. I think before I get to your question, Ambassador, I really want to start off by taking a look back of my experience prior to Daca and what that kind of meant for me growing up in the US. So I arrived here when I was 6 years old, and I went to school here, engaged in everything school kids do here in the US, engaged in school, homework, everything, checking all the boxes, right? Checking all the boxes to kind of reach that goal, because it was always instilled in me that education is the key to success, especially here in the United States. So that was kind of my pillar and my motivation to do the best that I could, get the good grades, and the opportunities will come. So those opportunities were starting to slip away, I knew my access to them were limited once I got to high school, and I wanted to start the application process to college and start, trying to seek a driver's license. Those were the instances where I now truly understood what it meant to be undocumented in the US. So those were really pivotal points in my life to really understand how to navigate that as a young teenager, and then eventually as a young adult. So those were pivotal points, but also they gave me the opportunity to see what I can do even besides my status to continue moving forward. So I think when Daca was released, June of 2012, I was a senior in high school, and 2 weeks afterwards was the announcement was made by the Obama administration. So that was just a huge relief for me, and kind of seeing where I wanted to plan and move forward. So following that, I was able to apply. I was able to sign on to the program rather quickly and enroll in community college down here in Florida. So following that, it was just Daca unlocked the potential that I had, and it just opened so many doors that were previously closed. And I think that can be said for the about 600,000 recipients, which 80% of them are of Mexican origin. And it's also really important when you look at aspects of the US Mexico bilateral relations when they talk about immigration and things like that. That 80% of DACA recipients are of Mexican origin. So I think DACA opened that opportunity, right? So I took it and I was able to complete community college and then move on to a four-year university. And the pivotal point for me there and why I got into this work in public policy and communication specifically to a point was I attended the 2016 Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio. So I actually got to witness President Trump now President Trump accept the nomination for the Republican Party. So it was a very interesting experience, but I knew following that convention, my career was in public policy, specifically because I knew this career would be the opportunity to inform policymakers through research. And I think as we see in day and age, research, facts, and what is actually going on is pivotal in this age of disinformation. So following the RNC, I knew my career was in Washington. Now I just had to find a way to get there. So I arrived to Washington. I was hired by the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. And my first day on the job, it was coincidentally, they were hosting now President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And that was also the day Jeff Sessions announced the rescission of DACA. So it was my first day as an intern, but also received, the news about the rescission of DACA. So again, kind of seeing, weighing the risk and the benefits. So I chose to stay in Washington, D.C. I chose to stay because I knew this is where I could truly thrive and make a difference in what I was passionate about, which is public policy. And I have no regrets ever since. I've been very fortunate to be able to build a career in Washington and work with so many great people that are truly interested in making, bettering the relationships, not only US and Canada and US and Mexico, but North America as a region. I think I found my niche here. So that's just a bit of my backstory. And to your question, Ambassador Verruga,
Yes.
I think about when it comes to where we are in the debate on immigration in the US, it just tends to defer, like you see different voices polarizing one way or another. But I mean, there is polling in the recent polling on Politico and Morning Consult, a majority of Trump supporters actually support protecting DACA recipients. So again, for this specific program, there is some sort of consensus where we can find a common ground to seek permanent protections for recipients. But I think there is definitely, we need to work on, that's just a baseline. We need to work on finding a pathway for comprehensive immigration reform. I think that's key and that's vital to kind of fix that system that has been broken for so many years.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's been a feature of most of political campaigns in the last, 25, 30 years. I would say after 1986, right? You will correct me, but I think this debate has been ongoing and leading nowhere. And it doesn't look like right now the political climate is, say, conducive to having a serious, constructive discussion on this matter, it seems to me, seen from south of the border, of course. I'd like to turn to Mitchell for 1 second. I read your bio, which is pretty much like Mariana's. I mean, that your potential unlocked the minute that these decisions came about and DACA was a reality. And tell us, Mitchell, what does it feel like living in limbo? Limbo is supposed not to be part of that place between hell and heaven, but you're somewhere there. Tell us what it's like especially once you have graduated from a legal school of the category of Harvard.
Primero, gracias por la invitación. So to your question, I'm less worried about individuals like myself and Mariana who have been able to firmly establish ourselves in the US and have built or are starting to build careers. We have networks. We have individuals and organizations that we could reach out to if things were to go south for us, and meaning in November, the election doesn't go the way that we would hope it would. I'm much more worried about the rest of the Daca community and non-Daca community, because don't forget, a lot of immigrants did not qualify for Daca, some by mere days, some by a couple of weeks. I'm much more concerned about individuals that haven't been able to, because of whatever circumstances they're in, been able to establish themselves on more stable footing in terms of their socioeconomic position. For individuals like that, I think a negative outcome in the election in November would have a much more severe impact, because one thing that sort of gets lost in this conversation regarding Daca is that the number isn't 800,000, the number isn't 1 million or whatever, however many Daca recipients there are. That number of people impacted, the ripple effect is much, much greater, because a lot of Daca recipients have families, whether children or immediate siblings, parents, who will also be severely impacted by that one person's Daca protection being taken away. A lot of Daca recipients are the breadwinners of their households. A lot of Daca recipients are vital members of the community, either through being business owners, homeowners. A lot of Daca recipients, again, the contribution to the US economy is substantial, not just because it's their own contribution, it's the contributions of those that they in turn support, right? And to that point, another thing that bothers me that gets lost in this conversation is that the push for Daca and for greater comprehensive immigration reform, in my personal opinion, should not be rooted in the economic contributions of the recipients. It should be rooted in the humanity of the recipients, right? The US, and I proudly consider myself American, I consider myself Mexican American, I consider myself American. We as a country, we tout our principles of caring about one another, care for your neighbor, care for the goodness of the country as a whole and our position on the global landscape, but yet we ignore this huge subset of individuals that are more than our nannies. Daca recipients have gone on to do amazing things, right? Whether it is becoming, like Mariana and I, professionals, even teachers, doctors, the person at your local favorite restaurant, like our contributions again are there. And I think that's one thing that gets lost, is just the other side. And by the other side, I mean people that oppose Daca as a policy or comprehensive immigration reform as a whole. I don't think they realize that some of their close friends or their child's, partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, someone that they, came across the street and had a friendly conversation with, those people are likely to be, Daca recipients or immediate relatives Daca recipients. So I don't think these individuals realize just how connected they are to the effects of this policy. So to just circle back to your original question, for myself, I'll figure it out. If the outcome in the fall is one where, President Trump wins and likely rescinds the policy, I'll figure it out. I mean, at the end of the day, I've figured it out up to now. I figured it out before DACA was in place. I figured it out after DACA was in place. But again, my more immediate concern is for individuals that haven't been able to find more stable footing for themselves.
Something that is very seldom said is that people like yourself would be a tremendous asset coming back to Mexico. I have to say that. I mean, you have two natures, if you will, two systems. You are bisystemical, and I think it would be tremendous to have a policy also in Mexico in terms of receiving people like yourself in case you so desire. I'd say really, truly, as I believe it is. I also see that you have a Los Angeles Dodgers baseball cap behind you, so I can see that you're a true masochist.
Well, you know, just a quick story. When my father first immigrated to the States, we settled in Los Angeles. He immediately knew the importance of trying to assimilate to the country, right? And one of the ways he wanted to do it was through sports. And just, he picked whatever sport he could understand. And he didn't understand football, and he wasn't a big fan of basketball. And so he found that there was a large Latino community in Los Angeles that really supported the Dodgers. And so ever since then, I've just been a diehard Dodgers fan.
The choice of baseball was all right. The team, I'm not too so sure. But anyway, Janet, I'd like to come back to you with a more, say, juicy issue, which has to do with politics and this environment we are going through, or you're going through in the United States right now. Do you see any prospects for an immigration reform if Joe Biden wins the presidency? Obviously, I mean, if you want also to comment on the prospects if Trump gets reelected, what's your take on that for a comprehensive reform on that goes beyond DACA, say?
Yeah, I think I know that he would be very interested in trying to achieve comprehensive reform. I think it will depend in part on the election for the U.S. Senate.
Right.
You know, if the Senate also changes parties so that the lower house of representatives, which I think will remain Democratic, but then the Senate is also Democratic and the president is Democratic, the chances for achieving immigration reform go up. It's still difficult, but you know, I would remind us all that the Senate in 2013 did pass a bipartisan comprehensive bill. And it wasn't a bad bill. It had a lot of the improvements in it that we wanted from the Obama administration side.
And it was very bipartisan at the time, yeah?
Yeah, it was supported by the so-called Gang of Eight.
Exactly.
The House of Representatives at that time refused to even hear the bill, so it just died. It was a real lost opportunity. But you know, the chances in the United States of dealing comprehensively with immigration, I think, depend on the Democrats. The Republican Party has gotten itself into, and this is a change for the Republican Party. They didn't used to be so anti-immigrant. In fact, you know, one of the liberalizations of our immigration policy was done under President Reagan. But as time has gone on, they have become more and more restrictive, and more and more beholden to the Trump view of immigration, which is very, very restrictive. So I think it will depend on the
Right now,
president, but also the composition of the Congress.
yes, I do agree. I mean, the Senate is crucial right now, almost for anything as it's turning out. But how do you see how this issue of migration is playing with the voters? Do you think that it has the potential to shift sides for people in general, or is something that is fixed on the minds of and straight lines, the Republican straight lines, the Democratic, and nothing will change?
You know, it's interesting. Immigration, and I'd be interested in what Alan and Mariana and Mitchell's perspectives are, but I have not seen immigration as dominant an issue this year as it was in 2016. I think it's because we've had the issue of the pandemic and the economic consequences of that, and also the issue of structural racism, particularly in our policing. And those are the issues that have dominated the public sphere. We're not hearing the chants of build the wall that we heard in 2016. So now, does that mean the Republican Party has changed its views on immigration? At least the Republicans that are in Washington, D.C., no. They're still going to be very restrictive.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, it's quite interesting to see that in these race debates that you're having right now, perhaps the strongest since the 60s, right? The Latino element is not so much in place. Am I right on that?
No, it's. I think you are right. It really the focus has been on Black Americans,
Right.
But
somehow the Latinos have not been dragged into this polarization of races, if I may call it that way.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's kind of interesting that it's turned out that way. You know, it's not as if the Latino population is not also affected by defects in our criminal justice system, but this has been primarily posed as a Black American issue.
But there's nothing like Latino Blacks and Latino Lives Matter or something like that.
Yeah. Not that I've seen. No.
I've seen no apparently.
Ambassador, let me just build on the Secretary's point. I think it's clear that the news cycle has shifted, and yes, border security and migration issues have taken second place or third place to the pandemic and to the racial discord in the country. But I think it's also could be a potential problem for the Democrats, in the sense that the reason that we now have no attention, in my view, on the migration issues is that we've basically seen the administration, for good reasons or not, use the pandemic to basically shut down the border with regard to so-called non-essential traffic. And that, coupled with the efforts that the Lopez Obrador administration has taken at the behest of the Trump administration to both patrol the southern portions of Mexico and to continue to host the Espera in Mexico, the so-called migration protection protocols, has really brought the flow essentially to a stop, so that the issue has not been garnering the attention. And while the use of public health to implement border control is perhaps in part warranted, there seems to be an ulterior purpose in much of what has been going on the border. And I think it's going to be a very important issue if the Democrats regain that, in fact, there be a working of the policy with Mexico, because I think it's fair to say that if, in fact, the migration protection protocols, if they're removed immediately, and they definitely, in my view, should be modified in important ways, But if they're removed immediately, I think we can expect to see large numbers of people coming from Central America in terms of the migration north, because the push factors out of the Northern Triangle have not changed. In fact, have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And then it's going to be a real challenge because, as we know, there are huge and monumental challenges awaiting a Biden administration in terms of the economy, in terms of dealing with the pandemic. And unless there is a real policy dialogue with Mexico about how we did in the past, cooperate with Mexico to manage those flows, I think it could turn out to be right back on the front page, Secretary.
And where I've seen the political pushback on immigration is related to when there's a sense that the border is out of control, and people feel like it's willy-nilly down at the southwest border, and that there's no law enforcement whatsoever. Then people I think they get scared in a way, and they don't like it, and then you get some political pushback. I certainly saw that in Arizona when I was the governor of Arizona.
Even though it has had implications for the asylum policy of the United States as well, that's a constitutional issue, is not it?
Yeah. They basically, Alan, shut down the refugee and asylum programs as well.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to take one of Mitchell's points. He mentioned about the economics of Daca. I think it's a very interesting feature as well, because he said that the humane aspects were the most important. I agree with that. But there's also this element that may entice some other members of the political fabric of the United States. What I read is that $250 billion worth of economic activity could be spread out if the Daca program would continue. And in tax revenues also as high. How do you take it? I would pose this to Mariana and Mitchell, or perhaps Mitchell and Mariana in that order, because that also counts, doesn't it, in terms of what Mrs. Napolitano was just saying right now, that there's this fear about the foreign, if you will, that is having an impact on the policies. But these economic aspects, how do you rate them?
Yeah, so aside from the contributions that DACA recipients and people adjacent to them have on the U.S. economy, don't forget that a large portion of the agricultural workers, of hospitality workers, of low-paid service workers are immigrant, whether documented or undocumented. So couple that with the fact that our federal minimum wage is much lower than it should be. You have this class of individuals, documented and undocumented, in these low-paying positions, agricultural, hospitality, service, that are pretty much discounting the lifestyles of American citizens, right? I mean, the groceries we buy here are discounted because someone down the line is being paid a wage that's below the poverty line, or our hotel stays are subsidized because the service worker isn't being paid what he or she should be. So these issues regarding the economy, they're important. And I think that's the message that's going to get pushed if comprehensive immigration reform ever comes, around again. It's going to be the contributions that we as as documented and undocumented immigrants have on the US economy. That being said, again, I circle back to the fact that it really should be rooted in the humanity of individuals, of people, right? I mean, the contributions are there. People, you throw numbers at them, there's always going to be, well, you say this number, you say this number. Numbers are just numbers, right? I think you have to reach out to, in my opinion, the heartstrings of the American public.
Right.
I think as a technical matter, however, as Alan said, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, it basically said, look, the Trump administration can rescind DACA, but they have to do it in the right way. And they have to show that they've taken into account all the costs and benefits of the DACA program. And one thing they clearly did not take into account were the economic contribution of the DACA recipients. I think that would have to go into the mix. And there was some pretty good briefing on that in the Supreme Court.
I'd like to turn to our communications expert, Mariana. I mean, what has been missing in the message? Because as everybody agrees here, there are a bunch of benefits, not only from the humanitarian side of things, but also on the political and even law and order aspects. How would you sell it if you were to market this, or what is missing in the marketing of DACA?
I mean, just to build on former Secretary's point, and also Mitchell, I think if you want to make the cost benefit analysis kind of argument, I think it is valuable, right? And especially in those red districts or swing districts where that's how you get your foot in the door, right? I don't work on that specifically, but I have a lot of colleagues and know a lot of organizations who work with members of Congress who are, trying to build the case from that cost benefit analysis. And when you tell them, well, X amount of agriculture crops comes from your district and you're benefited because there's access to visas for seasonal workers, that's where we need to start the conversations and aspects of, building the case for a larger comprehensive immigration reform. I think the numbers are very important, but again, to Mitchell's point, I think the humanity and really showcasing beyond the numbers, the work that these people do, especially right now in a pandemic. You have agricultural workers in California who are picking up our crops, pandemic, wildfires, whatever it is, they're getting food to the table. So I think it's just drawing, the initial step is bringing in the numbers kind of argument, but building on the stories and beyond my story, Mitchell's story, and others who are professionals, but just really the grassroots of the movement and circling back to that, because that's how we were able to push for DACA. Those are the roots of this movement.
Well, I think it's been a tremendous discussion. I'd like to turn the mic to our president, Luis Gerardo, chairman. I wonder if you have some comments or further thoughts on these issues.
This has been an extraordinary presentation of each and every one of you. And thank you, Janet, because now I have more insight about what DACA is. Thank you, Alan, and thank you both, Mariana and Mitchell, because your presentations have been very clear. And while you were presenting, I was taking notes. My understanding is that the Supreme Court's decision, as Alan was mentioning, is mainly based on procedural and formal merits. So, I mean, if I understand it correctly, it was mainly based, it mainly ruled on issues of reviewability. So we understand that the DHS was arguing that the rescission of Daca could not be reviewed by the judiciary since it was just a decision of non-enforcement, and there were some previous cases that stated that this kind of decisions could not be reviewed. And so the court confirms that the decision can be reviewed, which is which is good from an access of justice perspective. Then I understand that the court also ruled there were two memoranda. They solely determined that only the justifications of the first memoranda should be taken in consideration and not the justifications of the second memoranda, because the executive and agencies should not be allowed to use after the fact, just use justifications to justify a program like this, which is also good from a perspective of reliability. But then again, we have the Supreme Court of Justice deciding if the rescission was arbitrary or could have been arbitrary and capricious, and the Supreme Court of Justice rules that it may have been, but not because of a matter of fairness, but because of a matter of DHS not weighing and not considering all the arguments that were put in front of DHS at the moment of the rescission, including some of what Mitchell was describing as not considering what the immigrants could be contributing in the economy of the United States of America. And then finally, when the court goes into substance on the right of equality and the Fifth Amendment, they consider that there were not enough arguments presented to consider that there could have been an unequal protection or a violation to equality under the Fifth Amendment. Now, and I just wanted to pinpoint this, then to ask you, Janet, Alan, Mitchell, you're an attorney at law. I mean, I'm an attorney and I've studied law, and when I've found that there is unfairness, I generally go to the Constitution and find that there is a violation to the Constitution. So generally speaking, what I say is the Constitution is the fundamental law of the land, is the basic law of the land. And so when you find in practice something that is really unfair or something that is unfair, and you compare that to the Constitution, you finally find some amendment in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, that you find, or where you find a clear violation to the Constitution. And here, from what I reviewed, and I probably still need to put some more time on this important decision, but from what I reviewed, I mean, it was only the Fifth Amendment, the Equality Amendment was reviewed, and not others. So we're currently facing in the world, I believe, a situation where many parts of the world were stepping backwards in what it refers to human rights, to with regards to legal certainty, to due process of law. And we're facing, or we're seeing more and more and more arbitrary decisions. So my question here, since we have such a panel, is, I mean, is there a clear violation, because I do see an unfairness. Mitchell, Mariana, I think they have more contact with it. They still have contact with Mexico, and I'm glad of, with Latin America, I'm glad of that. But they have a clearly stronger connection with the U.S. They studied there, they worked there, they contributed to the United States of America, and suddenly you have this rescission that could jeopardize the situation of maybe 1.3 million people that have been in the situation where Mitchell and Mariana currently are. So my question is, under the U.S. Constitution, is there any of the amendments that we could consider violated besides the Fifth Amendment on equality?
Even though Secretary Napolitano is a far more accomplished appellate lawyer, I'll give her a minute to think and give you a response. So, Luis Arado, your general reflection on the retreat from human rights and democracy around the world is accurate. With regard to the U.S. Constitution, the claims were made not so much by the clients that Covington represented, UC and Janet Napolitano, but by other clients with regard to the due process claims, which we could debate, but I think basically and some people contend there's an equal protection claim, but in fact, I think the due process claim was the strong one to push. And the fact is that it was only, I believe, Justice Sotomayor who wrote the opinion suggesting and supporting that notion, and that in fact it was not accepted by the court. And I think at least it's clear to me, looking at the way the decisions came out, that in fact a due process claim would not succeed to turn back a properly processed, so to speak, issue with regard to the rescission under the Administrative Procedure Act. And while I agree with Mitchell and Mariana on the humanitarian elements of this, in fact, when you get down to the arguing the law on issues like the due process or the policy decision, in fact, the economic elements have always traditionally, perhaps they shouldn't, but they traditionally have taken an important role in that analysis. And I think just to build on the Secretary's observation, I actually have some data on the economic impact of the Daca program, which up until the COVID pandemic, 91% of Daca recipients were employed. There was a care, as Mitchell suggested, not only for themselves, but for 200,000 U.S. citizen children that are connected with Daca recipients. And that's not to mention the extended family network that Mitchell referred to. They've estimated that $215 billion in increased economic activity is attributable to the Daca program, including $60 billion in federal tax revenue. So yes, the non-economic factors are important, but the determinative ones will be others, for better or for worse, under the American legal system. And as I said, given the nature of the Supreme Court today, and given Chief Justice Roberts' refusal and the other justices' refusal, liberal and conservative, to go along with Justice Sotomayor, I don't believe that, at least in the short term that we're facing, that we can rely on novel constitutional arguments carrying the day here. But let me really defer to Secretary Napolitano.
Yeah, I think, Alan, you're right. We made our claim was based on statute, the Administrative Procedure Act, which is the federal law that governs how executive agencies can enact rules and how they can modify or rescind rules. And that was what was lacking here, but I don't think it rose to a constitutional violation. However, I will say this, the population of Daca recipients were very active advocates throughout this litigation. They were active on the steps of the Supreme Court on the day it was argued. And we made a point of really trying to emphasize the individuals who would be impacted if DACA were rescinded, and to help the court see through the statutory argument to the human impact on these hundreds of thousands of young people that a rescission would cause. And I actually think that is something that Chief Justice Roberts took into account, and that he really didn't want the court to take responsibility for removing DACA protections at this stage from all of these young people. So I think that individual advocacy by the immigrant rights groups, by the students, et cetera, who demonstrated and were on TV and were on social media, et cetera, had a real impact. I'd be interested in what Mariana, as a communicator, thinks about that.
Go for it.
Absolutely. I think that has been definitely pivotal, and I'm sure you all are aware of the campaign that, and the hashtag that was trending on Twitter, one of many, home is here. So I think campaigns like that and just fellow DACA recipients just sharing their stories throughout the various networks, on TV, on social media, it really gave a greater insight and more of a traction about why this decision is important. And I think to the former secretary's point, that humane aspect was really bolstered the legal argument that was presented at the Supreme Court. And I think that advocacy work still continues today. I follow many of the organizations and their continuous hard work to get permanent protections for recipients, but overall working towards finding, again, some comprehensive immigration reform, which I truly feel that is the end goal for our community.
I just can't imagine scenes of youngsters like young people like yourself being just rounded up and deported. I think that would be a tremendous shock to what the United States has symbolized in the world for such a long time, over a century or more. So to me, it's unthinkable, but let's knock on wood that that's not going to happen anyways. I promised you and everyone the question, which is who's going to win, in your mind, the next election. Let me start with Mitchell, and we'll move who you think will win, not who you like to win. All right? We can move on that one later on, but we have only 4 minutes, so you have 1 minute to say who will win and why you think will win.
I'll put it to you this way. I think that unless Joe Biden gets a little bit more aggressive in terms of his campaigning, connecting with a more diverse subset of the electorate. I unfortunately think that Donald Trump has a solid chance at a re-election.
Mariana?
Oof, that's a $1 million question everyone's asking. I think it's a toss-up, right? I mean, everyone, you have both campaigns really focusing on those purple states and really just flying in, trying to make sure and gather the vote. And the polling, it just shifts constantly. But I do feel that President Trump does have the opportunity to secure re-election. There is that possibility, even though we don't really want to think about it. Well, at least I don't. That is a very true and feasible option. But I do agree that there needs to be more connection, and especially running an election during a pandemic, virtually connecting with voters. I think that's a game changer that no one was expecting. So which campaign is able to come on top and really connect with voters virtually and make sure they turn out to the polls is yet to be seen.
Alan, what's your crystal ball saying?
I think it's a question of turnout. If the Democratic base turns out in the way that the Trump base turns out in the 6 critical states, given the peculiarities of our electoral college system, if the turnout is there, then Joe Biden should be elected. But I think what you're seeing now is given the fact that the border is no longer the whipping post for a Trump campaign, you're seeing an effort to frighten the seniors and to frighten the suburban housewives and mothers into not doing what they did in 2018, which is to support the Democratic candidate. So it's purely, in my view, a question of turnout, and I hope that people on the Democratic side will put aside the issues with regard to this is not the particular candidate that we would have preferred. If in fact we don't recognize the clear and present danger that another 4 years represents to American history, because it will be, many of these things will be irrevocable, then I think there is a chance that Trump will be reelected. But I must say to my fellow Democrats, if that happens, shame on us.
Well, Secretary Napolitano, you have the final word, and your vote counts 10 times.
Well, I will say this: Biden will win the popular vote, and he'll win it by more than Hillary Clinton won it. But the Electoral College is a toss-up, and right now I would actually give Biden a bit of an edge, but it's not much of an edge, and Trump is just getting started. So buckle your seatbelts. We're going to be in for a wild ride.
And yes, and we're awaiting 3 debates, right? And one between the vice presidential candidates as well. So the season is just starting, as you said. Well, I can thank you enough. The time has run out. I can thank you enough. Really, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Alan, for all your efforts to convey such a great group of people. I'm really, really pleased and happy from the Aspen Institute in Mexico that we had the pleasure and privilege to have Secretary Napolitano, Mariana, and Mitchell. I hope you can visit us over here. The tacos are still as good as they used to be. So don't miss an opportunity to come over. And Alan, again, thank you very much. I leave the final word to Luis Gerardo if you want to say goodbye. Thank you again.
Just to thank our panelists. Thank you for an excellent presentation, and thank our participants. And we hope to see you again soon in more Aspen Mexico Institute webinars. I would just like to mention that I am convinced and acknowledge unity, and I believe in justice and fairness. This decision has to do with all of that, and we will be following what happens next on Daca from Aspen Institute, Mexico. Thank you all.